Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Xavier Birchfield. On today's episode, I'm joined by Mike Gatto, former member of the California State Assembly. In our conversation, we talked about his time in the legislature, how he navigated policy in Sacramento, how to approach conversations in an extremely polarized environment, and his advice for the youth. So, with that, here's our conversation. I'd like to start by asking how you got started on your journey in politics, law, etc., and how you got to where you are now.
So that is the best question that people ask because, a lot of times when you talk with someone who has made it, there's like a big gap between like, this is my childhood and here I am now. And they often don't want to tell you the ways to actually like become who they became. So for me, my parents were not involved in politics. They were not involved in elective office and they didn't have powerful connections. But the way that I was able to develop those connections that I needed to get into public office was simply by volunteering for campaigns starting at the age of about 17. I can't tell you what a good experience that was. If you think about it, you think about like powerful people out there, you think about politicians, and you think about people involved in government officials. They have something that everybody wants. I don't care if you're Elon Musk, building cars and rockets, or if you're the most elite doctor in the world, or if you're the most elite businessman in some other field, business person in some other field. Everybody wants or needs something from the government. And so what I found very quickly is that if you go and work for these, members of Congress or, the governor or the state treasurer, so anybody in office, you volunteer for anybody in public office, even a local city council member, their events, their fundraisers, their open houses, whatever they put on, the people who come there are fascinating people who are extraordinarily well connected. Those people can not only help you when your time comes to run for office, but even if you decide not to go in politics, let's say you're just like, you know what, I want to become a doctor. Okay, great. Well, chances are you met the most powerful doctors in the world because they are there lobbying that member of Congress or that member of the legislature. So for me, it was really just getting exposed to all these different people through volunteering for campaigns.
Okay, so for you specifically in your situation, these people that you met through volunteering campaigns, what did they do for you that helped, I guess, propel your career?
Yeah, great question. So people, I'm sure you've heard that money has a big role in politics,
Mhm.
right? And it does. My district, I represented 500,000 people. The average California state senator represents 1 million people. You just do some math about like how many people needed to vote for me to get elected. And then talk about like how do you communicate with those people? Well, people will say, "Oh, post something on social media," but believe it or not, very few voters actually read and pay attention to social media. You can't run a campaign for free. If you could, everybody would be elected, right? Everybody would just run for office, post something cute on social media, and they would get elected. You have to pay for communications. Some of the ways that people pay for communications, believe it or not, particularly for voters who are older, is by sending them a piece of mail, sending them a piece of snail mail to their house where they read it and they say, oh, this is my position on the issues. This is how I feel about the environment. This is how I feel about development. This is how I feel about healthcare, right? Um, People also pay for, digital advertising, of course, advertising on YouTube, Facebook, whatever, TikTok, Instagram, all of that costs money. And if you figure you're communicating with, let's say, 300,000 of the 500,000 voters, and let's say you spend just $1 communicating to 300,000 voters for one communication, that's $300,000. Now, there's a principle in politics that you have to send a message to somebody 3 times for them to actually accept it. So, like, let's say I put an ad on your Instagram feed and, like, it's like, Mike Gatto, he's the best on the environment, right? That ad will probably go right past you once. You won't even notice it. The second time you might notice it. The third time you'll be like, oh, I think I've seen this. My brain recognizes it.
Mhm.
So I'm going to try to pay attention. So now we're talking, okay, so just to get elected like I did, you have to communicate to 300,000 people at least 3 times each, and the average cost is $1. Well, I'm not good with math. I'm a Democrat, but that's $900,000, right? $900,000 just to send a very, very basic campaign out on how you feel on the issues, right?
Mm.
So you need money to run for office, and you need to raise that money from a whole lot of people. And those people are typically found at existing political fundraisers.
Okay. Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess transitioning a little bit, was elected office always your end goal when you knew you wanted, or did you always know you wanted to be in elected office, or is that something that kind of formulated over time?
Yes, yes. I've had detours and I've had horrible parts of my life where I actually practiced law, but being in elective office is such a gift.
Hmm.
It is so it is such a deep honor for 500,000 Californians to say, this is the person I want representing me in the Capitol. It is such a deep honor. And if you have a gift, which I like to think there's not too many things in life I'm good at. I'm good at putting babies to sleep. I'm good at picking out dogs. But one thing I also have a fairly decent gift for, I think, is communicating very complicated ideas to a wide variety of people and getting consensus.
Hmm.
So I took on bills and legislation that were very hard, and I could explain them to Democrats and Republicans and get both of them to accept and to support my bills. And I like to think that made me an effective lawmaker. Look, I got 55 measures signed into law.
Yeah.
That's a lot. And so yeah, I always thought that I would seek to be an elected leader and try to represent my fellow Californians and try to push for more sensible government because Lord knows our government is really messed up and we need a lot of reforms in government right now.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That was great. Now that I think we're in the part where you've entered elected office assembly, what surprised you the most about how policymaking really works? And do you think that it was similar to what you expected when you were doing political experience as a younger as a younger male?
Yeah, great question. So I guess like to summarize your question, it's basically what surprised me and
Yeah.
like was it possible to really get a sense of
Hmm.
how life really was in elective office?
Yeah.
Um, so it has gotten some media attention. There's a famous quote by Nancy Pelosi where she says like something like, "We have to vote on this bill so that we can read it," right? And like I think people would be surprised at the number of pieces of legislation that the California legislature votes on any given day. We take thousands of votes in a year.
Hmm.
Some days we vote on as many as 150 different bills. Uh, people like that was a little jarring to me. You like to think that you're going to read absolutely every word of a piece of legislation and make sure that you understand it deeply. Now, I actually tried to do that. I tried to read every piece of legislation before me. Or, alternatively, I had a really terrific staff who, mostly people in their 20s, who read every piece of legislation, briefed me on it, and made sure that I knew everything. But what I'll try to tell you though is that there's a lot of different. So that was shocking, but at the same time, it's not shocking. And people are like, "Oh, you voted on a bill, but you didn't read it." Well, yeah, there's certain pieces of legislation that you do have some trust for your colleagues. If your colleague stands up and says, "Hey, this is my piece of legislation," it's changing the speed limit by schools from 25 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour. I mean, they're not lying to you, or and you also have to trust in the process that there's always two sides to every story. And the piece of legislation that are super controversial, you know it because people are fighting those and fighting those and fighting those. And yeah, those pieces you pour over every single word, often many times. You read it before it comes before committee, you read it before it goes to the whole legislative body for a vote. So, but that is still something that I think would shock most people, and definitely shock me, is how many votes we took, and how little time there is to process everything.
Yeah. So I guess on that, how did you adjust to that? Was it hard to adjust to that sheer amount of work you had to do when it came to all these bills that were being introduced and things like that? How is it adjusting to that?
Great question. So time management is a big issue when you're in
Hmm.
elected office. There's a principle that I should back up and start with, and that is when people ask me, are politicians good people? I will say that it's like any other profession. There are really bad people. There's basketball players who are total jerks. There's basketball players who are really nice and they're donating to charity and they're doing good things. It's the same in politics, but I call it roughly the rule of one third. 1/3 of people get into politics for the right reasons. They have a pure heart. They want to do good, and they're able to stay relatively pure. They continue to want to do good things. Another third get into politics for the wrong reasons, and they're just bad people. They always have been, and they're the other side of the coin. They're just bad people. And then a final third, they get in for the right reasons. They want to do something good. They want to help people, but then they get seduced by power and they get corrupted. And sometimes I don't mean like clear corruption, like, oh, here's a bag of cash, vote how I want you to. That's actually very rare, thank God. But what I'm talking about is it's very easy to get seduced by the fact that, people want to golf with you all day long. People want to hang out with you. People want to buy you drinks, like all that stuff. And a lot of politicians get seduced by that. Um, Politics, when done right, is an 18-hour day job. I mean, I could open up my office at 8 in the morning and close it at 8 o'clock at night, and there would be somebody who wanted to meet with me every 15 minutes. And there would be a line if we let them. So, and that doesn't even factor in like, you also have to give speeches and you have to do this and you have to raise money and everything like that. It's a very, very intense, job. But I knew that going in. I knew that going in. That was not shocking to me. I think it was a little shocking to my family, and I think like like sometimes you date women or whatever, and they're like, "My God, you work so hard." It's like, yeah, that's how it is. But at the same time, once I had kids, that changed everything for me, and I started to, I mean, they became my main priority versus just politics.
Yeah. Okay. Also, I don't think you've mentioned it, but I know that you chaired appropriations, and that's an extremely powerful committee in the legislature. Similar to what we were just talking about, how did you manage that responsibility, and what did it feel like day to day? How did you manage your time, like you were saying?
Yeah. So I'll tell people a little bit about appropriations, and this will get a little bit in the weeds, but forgive me, but I think it's necessary. So
Okay.
appropriations at the federal level is still a very, very powerful committee. What happens is at the federal level, they will set the state budget. They will say, the United States of America is going to spend $10 billion on freeways this year. And then the appropriators say, okay, we're going to give, a billion to the 405, a billion to the 110, and they actually they appropriate the funds that Congress has budgeted. In California, it's different. It's different. We have a budget committee as well, and the budget committee sets the budget, and they also appropriate within the budget. The Appropriations Committee in the California legislature has two qualities that make it unique. Number one, it handles all legislation that is not budget legislation that costs the state anything, which is pretty much every piece of legislation. So, for example, if you wanted to create, that legislation we talked about where someone changed the speed limit around schools from
Yeah.
25 to 20 miles an hour,
Mm-hmm.
usually there's an enforcement component, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody's got to write a ticket if someone is speeding. But more importantly, someone's got to go and change the signs from 25 miles an hour limit to 20 mile an hour. That costs money. Everything costs the state money. Everything. If you're going to change the rules for a driver's license, someone's got to reprogram the DMV computers. Like everything costs the state money. So the Appropriations Committee handles all of those bills. And on top of that, the chair of appropriations, yours truly, the chair of appropriation has a legislative veto. So most people know that the legislature passes bills and then the governor can sign or veto them. The chair of appropriations has a thing called the suspense file. And what it can do is it can take a bill that is costly, you suspend it, you stop it from going through the legislative process, and then at the end of the year, you basically announce, the chairperson announces whether that bill is proceeding or not. So you can actually stop a lot of legislation in its tracks if it's a bad piece of legislation. After engaging in a cost benefit analysis, of course, and seeing if it costs the state too much money. So it's a very, 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 very powerful position. And it was one that I wanted to do from the minute I got elected to the legislature. I sat on the Appropriations Committee. I saw its tremendous ability to affect people's lives. And it was it was a tremendous honor to get that chairmanship, and I loved every minute of it. It was really good. And we tried to, you can put your fingerprints on a whole lot of policy as chair of appropriations where your name isn't even on the legislation. If you don't want to take the credit, you let others take the credit, but then you can redraft the language of their bills for them too when it's on suspense. And you can really do a lot for the state. And so I like to think I left my mark on the state, not only with the 55 measures I authored, but also the stuff that I edited when I was chair of appropriations.
Yeah, well, speaking of the high amount of legislative output, it was 55 measures. from your perspective, what do you think was the biggest factor in your efficiency? And yeah, and how did you pass so many pieces of legislation effectively?
Um, so this is going to sound kind of funny, but and I assume I'm not allowed to curse, so I'll tell this story in a more clean version. But there was a colleague of mine he was in his 60s or 70s when I got elected. I was very young when I got elected. I think it was the second youngest, but he passed on some advice that he had gotten when he first got elected. And the advice he was given was, shut the F up. Basically, don't talk, don't give a lot of speeches, be low key, work behind the scenes. When you do talk, people will pay attention more. So I followed that advice. I tried to talk very rarely. I didn't give a lot of speeches. I didn't grandstand. But I'll tell you, when I spoke on a bill, when I spoke on a piece of legislation, whether it was mine or somebody else's, people listened. People paid attention. They would be like, huh, this guy rarely talks, and now he's saying something. This must be important. And so that was one factor in getting legislation passed. The second one was simply working with everybody. It's amazing what you can get accomplished if you actually call the disparate parties into one room and you get them talking and you say, what's important to you? What are your concerns? What are you worried about? How can I address that? My rule of thumb was that unless I could get it to a point where like 65 or 70% of the public and 65, 70% of my colleagues would support it, then it was probably not something I should do. But because I tried to build consensus, my stuff would sail through, and it was a lot easier. I mean, I had some close ones, but most of the time, just following those two rules made it, a lot easier for me and my staff.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember you also telling us about a story similar when you had to let other people talk at Capitol Convoy. But I guess following up on that, do you think it's mostly letting other people talk? Do you think that that fosters some sort of relationship or compromise, or like, is it something else entirely in
Well,
terms
yeah.
of?
So, I mean, that's a skill. That's a skill that has relevance not only in politics, but I think just in life in general. I
Mhm.
mean, people have forgotten what it's like to listen. And I think just making sure that you're a good listener has so much relevance in any profession you want to go in. Just, people will express what they want and what they need and how they feel. You just have to listen. You have to let them, you know, um, let them vent to you. And it's shocking. Politics has a lot of people with really big egos. And if you can be the one who listens versus talks, you'll go very, very far.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you are listening more, what did you do to get your points across more effectively compared to those who are just, getting up and talking and talking and talking?
Sure. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I would try to let the merits of my bill speak for my merits of my legislation speak for
Okay.
itself. But there's also look, there's techniques for engaging in conversations with people where at least once they have articulated what they might have a concern with your legislation, just make sure you address it. Make sure you repeat back to them what exactly it is that they're concerned about and how you're going to address it. And then building trust is also really, really big. There's a lot of trust in the legislature. There has to be. Sometimes there will be a deadline that has to be met, and a piece of legislation has to get out of a committee before a deadline. And you don't have time to actually get the amendments and the changed language into that committee before the deadline. And so sometimes you will tell the committee chairperson, I give you my word. I am going to do what you asked. Just let this bill proceed. Don't kill it for the year. And I give you my word, I'll fix it in the next committee. I tried to never, ever, 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 ever break my word. And because of that, your word is your currency in Sacramento. I mean, you can trade on that. And if you give people your word and you actually follow through, they respect you so much more.
Yeah. Okay. Um, Now I also know that you worked on some technological and like innovation related issues. Why is that area so important to you?
Gosh, you look at how much technology dominates our lives, and you look at how important it is. I like to think I was way, way, way ahead of my time because I mean, some of the
You
stuff we were working on like 10
were,
years
yeah.
ago. Let me give you an example. There were school districts 10 years ago who were like spying on the social media of their students, even when the students were not on campus. You think about how intrusive and invasive that is. Like, you log on to the Wi-Fi at your school. but then somehow the school puts something in your phone, or they just hire an outside firm to monitor all your social media activity, even when you're not at school. And then they, are reporting that to the principal. Like, I thought that was horribly invasive then. People are starting to wake up to it now. And so, I ran legislation on that. DNA, right? Like, people don't know this, but every baby born in California since, I don't know, maybe 17 years ago, they prick your heel when you're born and they store your blood in California and they sell it to researchers to research things in the aggregate. It's de-identified. But of course, DNA is never really de-identified. I mean, if somebody gets a copy of your DNA, I mean, it's you, right? And they might not have your name, but I mean, they could find your ethnic heritage. They could find out if you have a propensity towards alcoholism. They could find out who your parents are. There's so many different things that they can do with that, and I don't think we have enough privacy protections for young people baked in California law. And so we were working on that 10 years ago. There's a whole lot of different stuff that we're trying to be ahead of our time on, and of course now, obviously everybody's talking about artificial intelligence and how that's
Mhm.
going to affect people's lives. But these issues are not easy. There's a lot of I think well-deserved anxiety out there from a lot of people on these issues.
Yeah, definitely. Like you said, all of these issues are moving extremely fast, especially AI. And with that, how do you keep up, especially because law is much slower than innovation and all this potentially unsafe development that you might be having to regulate? So, how do you try to keep up?
The most important thing in life is reading a lot.
Hmm.
Again, whatever profession you're in, but definitely when you're in politics is in government, you got to read a lot. You got to like sometimes like there would be like a newspaper article that came out, and I would read it on my phone, and like to me it was like truly alarming. Like let's say like the article came out and was like, schools are spying on kids when they're not at school. Okay. And then like I would go and talk with my colleagues. I'd be like, "Hey, did you see that article?" Like, no, what are you talking about? You haven't heard of this? No, not at all. And it's like, how could you how could you do your job if you're not reading about the things that affect people's lives? You got to read a lot. And you can't just read the stuff that's your point of view. If you're a Democrat, you can't just read the stuff or watch the stuff that appears on CNN. If you're a Republican, you can't just do that for Fox News. You have to read everything. You have to read progressive, liberal, conservative, and everything in between, because that's the only way that you'll get a decent picture of what the truth is. But then once you digest it, you've got to try to act. And so the media does a tremendous service in this country by making people aware of important issues. Just read them.
Yeah. Okay. And like you said, you read every single piece of information, whether it's Democratic, Republican, etc. How do you think that you balanced that and I guess came to a conclusion, decision, opinion on how to act? Because you're being fed these pieces of information that might differ ideologically. So how do you think that you like
Yeah, I mean,
regulated that?
you got to have a good BS detector. You have to of course understand that there is nobody on the planet who is not biased.
Right.
Everybody has a bias in some way, and everybody has some degree of political perspective. And just knowing that a specific newspaper or a specific TV channel has a certain bias, but then even knowing that a certain reporter has a certain bias, you just have to put their content through that lens and make sure that you filter it appropriately. I mean, look, if a Republican says that Joe Biden is the worst human being who's ever walked the planet, and a Democrat says that Donald Trump is the worst human being who's ever walked the planet, you got to consider the source. I mean, who's saying it, right? I mean, I would often challenge people who are that extreme to say, "Hey, tell me one good thing that so and so has done." Because everybody has done one or two good things in their life, and everybody who's in public office has done one or two good things. And if someone cannot come up with one good thing that somebody has done of another party, I mean, they're a very, very, very biased person, and you probably shouldn't trust much that they say.
Okay. Also, I wanted to go back to the topic of, I mean, similar to the topic of how you passed all these bills effectively, but a little bit different. You served 4 terms and won 8 elections to do so. Um, how do you think that you stayed so, I guess, quote unquote, popular, like politically durable? Um, and how did you navigate these party politics to stay in office for such
Great
a
question. So the first election is always the hardest. My first election, I was going up against the president of the school board in the biggest city in my district. So my district was Hollywood and Silver Lake and the Hollywood Hills and Los Feliz and Glendale and Burbank and La Cañada and La Crescenta and I was going up against the very popular president of the school board in the biggest city in my district. And I didn't hold any elective office at the time. And, I didn't really have a base, but what I tried to do is communicate effectively to the voters. I called so many of them myself. I called them and I left them messages and I gave them my cell phone number. And I said, you got any questions? Give me a ring, and was able to win that election against the odds. I was not considered the favorite. And then my third election, I was up against another school board president in that city, again with a huge base and everything like that. Was able to defeat him, and once you get past your first two or three or four elections, like it gets a lot easier. The irony is, my biggest total I won with next close to 70% of the vote in a district that was 40 something percent my party. So think about that. Like, to me, that was a tremendous honor because it meant that everybody, Democrats, Republicans, and independents were voting for me.
Mhm.
But I want to say that my seventh election, yeah, I came close to 70% in a district that was 48% of my party. And so I don't know, like I felt like I was doing something right. And I like to think it really just centered around communication.
Yeah, so that's really impressive. And like you said, it definitely gets easier as you progress in terms of the elections.
For
But
sure.
do you think there was anything you did to maintain that position and
Yeah.
reputation that
Yeah.
ensured your success?
Yeah, so what I did is I answered every email that was sent to me. My district had, again, 500,000 people. I got about 58,000 emails a year. The legislature counts it for you, and they give you a total. And we would answer every single one of them. Some of them were form letters, right? People would, that somebody would post something on social media saying, "Hey, there's a bill about, again, let's pick on reducing the speed limit. There's a bill on reducing the speed limit around schools. School zones are unsafe. Write or text or email your representative and tell them this." And so we would get like a form message like that, 50 or 100 or 200 people would send to us about the same thing. But I would read it, and once we recognized the form, we would send the same response to all 200 people. But I answered every single email. And what that also means is sometimes people would email me and they would just say, "Hey, how are you going to vote on Assembly Bill 123 or Senate Bill 456?" And I tell them, I wouldn't hide the ball. I wouldn't say, "Gee, I don't know yet." I was like, "Oh, yeah, yeah, that bill sounds like it makes sense. I'm going to vote yes on it." And they were so shocked. Like, you answered me and you were honest and you didn't like give a whole bunch of fluff. And so I think that was I tried to tell, like, most of my colleagues would say emails and social media comments are a nuisance. And they really thought that. They thought, like, if someone comments at you on social media, it's a nuisance. It's like, no, it's an opportunity. Somebody cares enough about something to reach out to you, like, answer them back. I don't care what they say, like, answer them back. It's an opportunity. You can make a friend. And that's how I approach things. And I think that set me apart from 90% of my
A lot
colleagues.
of, yeah, yeah. Um, Now, lastly, I'd like to move into the part more about youth in politics today. I guess to yourself as 16, 17-year-old, or any really teenager who cares a lot about um, the world, public policy, and wants to change the world, what is one piece of advice that you would give them?
Great question. Great question. So we already talked about several pieces of advice that I think are very important for
Mhm.
politics.
If there was one, just one.
Wow, okay, being a good listener, volunteering, getting involved early. The Gosh, I mean, I have to narrow it down to just one.
Well, no, I mean, I know it's difficult because all of these are really valuable lessons, but I guess to be more specific, what is one, I guess, personality trait or I guess word that you would use to describe the way you would want someone to be when it comes to success?
Okay, that's a fair question. So I'm going to change it up a little bit, and I'm
Okay.
not going to repeat myself because I already gave the other two, but
Yeah.
I would say research. I would say
Okay.
being prepared, right?
Hmm.
Because in 500 BC, there was a Greek author who wrote a book that said, "Hey, there's nothing new under the sun," right? And if they were saying that in 500 BC, you can imagine how it is now. Just about everything has been thought of, just about everything that, even stuff with AI legislation. It's the same stuff that people were proposing in the 1600s for textile folding stuff. Like there's a new technology. Some people want it regulated, some people don't, and they fall into these certain themes and patterns. And then specifically with other stuff, right? Like, like people, for example, will come to you. Sometimes they'll say, "Hey, we've got to do something about so and so. Like, you got to run a bill." And it's like, "Yeah, we passed that bill last year." Or like, "Well, how about like, yeah, yeah, we did that 2 years ago."
Yeah.
And so just being prepared, doing your research, knowing your stuff, becoming an expert. That is something that is so important, and people respect that profoundly. So I think like, when youth get involved in politics, it's important you're getting involved and it's really important and people need to hear the voice of younger people, but don't just rely on that. Do your research and make sure that you're the best prepared person in the room.
Yeah, that's really insightful. Well, thank you so much. This has been a really detailed interview, and I think it's given a lot of beneficial information. Um, I really appreciate you coming on. It was a great interview.
Thank you for doing this. And if anybody
Yeah.
needs to contact me, you can give them my website,
Hmm.
mikegatto.com. I
Yeah,
still
I
answer
will.
every single email.